Imagine a king who may have never existed. No crown, no castle, no throne. And yet his legend shaped the dreams of an entire civilization. This is Arthur, the Shadow King whose myth became more powerful than any real empire. But before we drift off into the story, subscribe, leave a like and comment where you are listening from so others can find their way here too. Now let us journey back to the misty hills of ancient Britain to discover the truth behind the world's greatest legend. The story of King Arthur does not begin with a sword or a stone. It begins with the collapse of an empire. In the year 410 AD, something unthinkable happened. The mighty Roman Empire, which had ruled Britain for nearly 400 years, simply left. The legions that had built roads and walls and cities across the island were recalled to defend Rome itself from barbarian attacks. The people of Britain, who had grown used to Roman protection, Roman laws and Roman civilization, were suddenly abandoned. They were told to look after their own defences. The great military machine that had kept them safe was gone forever. What followed was a period of darkness and chaos that historians call the Dark Ages. Written records became scarce. The great Roman cities began to crumble. The magnificent bathhouses where citizens had once gathered fell into ruin. The heating system stopped working. The aqueducts that had brought fresh water cracked and dried up. Roads that had been maintained for centuries became overgrown. Local warlords and petty kings rose up to fill the vacuum of power. Without the central authority of Rome, every ambitious man with a sword and a band of followers could declare himself a lord. And from across the cold North Sea came new invaders. The Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes were Germanic tribes from what is now Denmark and northern Germany. They were fierce warriors who had never been conquered by Rome. They worshipped different gods. They spoke a different language. They had no attachment to the Roman way of life that the Britons still remembered. They came first as raiders, appearing suddenly on the coast to burn villages and carry off plunder. Then they came as settlers, establishing permanent communities on the eastern shores. Then they came as conquerors, pushing inland with fire and sword. The native Britons fought back desperately. They had inherited the military traditions of Rome. Many of their leaders had served in the Roman army or were descendants of those who had. They knew how to fight in disciplined formations. They had armour and cavalry, but they were divided among themselves. The petty kings squabbled and betrayed each other. No single leader could unite them against the common enemy. Year by year, decade by decade, the Saxons pushed the Britons further west, into the mountains of Wales, into the moors of Cornwall, into the wild highlands of Scotland. The old Roman-British way of life was being erased, replaced by a new Anglo-Saxon culture that would eventually become England. It was in this age of fire and sword, of desperate last stands and fading memories of a better time, that the legend of Arthur was born. Not as a fairy tale, but as a glimmer of hope. The native Britons facing extinction needed a hero. They needed to believe that once, someone had stood against the tide and won. They needed a story to remind them of who they were and what they had lost. And so the memory of a real war leader, a man who may have lived in the late 5th or early 6th century, began to grow. It grew into something larger than any single man could ever be. It grew into a legend. The earliest written mention of Arthur comes not from a grand chronicle, but from a simple list. Around the year 829 AD, a Welsh monk named Nennius compiled a work called the History of the Britons. In this rather messy collection of old legends and records, he mentions a war leader named Arthur. Nennius does not call him a king, he calls him a dux bellorum, a Latin phrase meaning leader of battles. He writes that Arthur fought alongside the kings of the Britons against the invading Saxons. Then Nennius lists 12 great battles that Arthur supposedly won. The final and most famous of these was the Battle of Baden Hill, where Arthur is said to have carried the cross of Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and 3 nights, and where the Britons won a crushing victory that halted the Saxon advance for a generation. This single paragraph in an obscure Welsh text is one of the only pieces of historical evidence we have for a real Arthur. It is frustratingly vague. We do not know where these battles were fought. We do not know when exactly Arthur lived. We do not know if he was a Roman-style general, a Celtic chieftain, or simply a legend that had already attached itself to a list of old British victories. But the mention is important. It tells us that by the 9th century, just a few hundred years after he supposedly lived, the name Arthur was already famous. He was already a symbol of British resistance, a champion who had once pushed back the darkness. The legend had already begun. Another early source adds a different flavour to the story. The Annals of Wales, written around the 10th century, records 2 entries related to Arthur. The first notes the Battle of Badon, saying that Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ for 3 days and 3 nights on his shoulders, and the Britons were victors. The second entry is far more sombre. It records the Battle of Camelot, in which Arthur and Medrawd fell. It gives no details about who Medrawd was or why they fought. It simply records their deaths together. This brief and tragic note would later blossom into one of the most famous betrayals in all of literature. Medrawd would become Mordred, Arthur's traitorous son, and Camelot would become the final apocalyptic battle that ended the golden age of Camelot. If a real Arthur existed, what was he actually like? Historians have proposed many theories. Some believe he was a Romano-British cavalry commander, a man who had inherited the military traditions of the Roman Empire. The Britons had once served in the Roman legions. They knew how to fight in organised formations, how to use heavy cavalry to devastating effect. A skilled commander using these Roman tactics against the less organised Saxon warbands could have won impressive victories. Others believe Arthur was a Celtic warlord, a leader of a roving warband that travelled across Britain to fight wherever he was needed. This would explain why his battles are said to have taken place across such a wide geographic area. He was not a king of a single territory, but a mercenary hero, a champion for hire. The truth is that we will probably never know for certain. The real Arthur, if he existed, lived in an age that left almost no written records. He existed in the gap between the fading light of Roman literacy and the eventual emergence of medieval chronicles. His story was passed down not in books but in songs, in poems recited around campfires, in the oral traditions of the Welsh and Cornish peoples. Each time the story was told, it changed a little. Details were added. Other heroes were merged with his legend. Real events became confused with myths. By the time anyone thought to write it all down, the man had become completely inseparable from the myth. For centuries after the earliest mentions, the legend of Arthur simmered quietly in the folklore of Wales and Cornwall. The Welsh bards sang of him in their courts. They told of Arthur's warband, his fierce warriors, and his magical adventures. These were not written histories. They were songs and poems memorised and performed by professional storytellers who travelled from lord to lord. Each telling was slightly different. Details were added or dropped based on the audience. The bards competed to make their versions more exciting, more dramatic, more wonderful. In these early Welsh tales, Arthur is not yet the noble Christian king of later stories. He is wilder, stranger, more like a figure from pagan mythology. He hunts magical boars across the hills of Wales. He raids the underworld to steal a magic cauldron. He interacts with giants and witches and gods in disguise. His world is not the world of castles and tournaments that we associate with medieval romance. It is an older world, a world where the boundaries between the human and the supernatural are thin and easily crossed. His companions are not yet polished knights in shining armour. They are rough warriors with names like Kai and Bedwyr, men with supernatural abilities who seem more like demigods than medieval courtiers. One of the most important of these early Welsh texts is a collection of tales known as the Mabinogion. Though written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, these stories preserve much older oral traditions. In one tale called Culhwch and Olwen, Arthur appears as the king of a court filled with hundreds of warriors, each with a strange and unique power. One man can hear an ant moving 50 miles away, another can drink an entire sea. Arthur himself is portrayed as a generous lord who helps his young cousin Culhwch complete a series of impossible tasks to win the hand of a giant's daughter. The Arthur of these Welsh tales is magnificent and powerful, but he is not yet the Arthur we know today. He is a Celtic king in a world of magic, not a Christian emperor in a world of chivalry. The transformation of Arthur from a Celtic war hero into a medieval Christian king began in the 12th century. The man most responsible for this change was a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth. Around the year 1136, Geoffrey completed a book called The History of the Kings of Britain. He claimed it was a translation of a very ancient book in the British language that had been given to him by a friend. Modern historians believe he made most of it up, drawing on Welsh legends, classical sources, and his own vivid imagination. But the medieval world did not care about historical accuracy. They cared about a good story. and Geoffrey told a magnificent one. Geoffrey's history was not just about Arthur, it told the entire legendary history of Britain, from its supposed founding by Brutus, a refugee from the fall of Troy, down to the last British kings before the Saxon conquest. But the Arthur section was by far the most dramatic and detailed. It gave Arthur a full biography for the first time. It placed him in a specific historical context, even if that context was largely invented. It made him not just a war leader, but a true king, comparable to the great rulers of classical antiquity. Geoffrey's Arthur was a figure of world historical importance, not just a local British hero. Geoffrey described how Arthur was the son of Uther Pendragon, king of Britain, and Igraine, a beautiful duchess. Arthur's conception was the result of a magical deception arranged by the wizard Merlin. Uther lusted after Igraine, but she was married to another lord, the Duke of Cornwall. Uther went to war against the Duke, but he could not get Igraine out of his mind. Merlin used his magic to disguise Uther as Igraine's husband, allowing him to enter her bed while the real Duke was away fighting. That very night, the Duke was killed in battle. Igraine later married Uther, never knowing the truth of how Arthur had been conceived. Arthur was the child of this union. After Uther's death, the young Arthur proved his right to the throne by some great test. Though Geoffrey does not yet mention the famous sword in the stone, he became king while still a teenager and immediately began to display the qualities of a great warrior and leader. Geoffrey described Arthur as a mighty conqueror. He did not simply defend Britain from the Saxons, he crushed them utterly. Then he turned his ambitions outward. He conquered Ireland, Iceland, Norway, and Gaul. He built a magnificent court and attracted the finest warriors in the world. His fame spread across Europe. Eventually, the Roman emperor demanded that Arthur pay tribute and submit to Rome. Arthur refused. He gathered his armies and marched on Rome itself. He was on the verge of conquering the Eternal City when he received terrible news from home. His nephew Mordred, whom he had left in charge of Britain, had betrayed him. Mordred had seized the throne and taken Arthur's queen Guinevere for himself. Arthur rushed home to face the traitor. The two armies met at the Battle of Camelot. It was a day of slaughter. Nearly all of Arthur's finest knights were killed. In the end, Arthur and Mordred faced each other in single combat. Arthur killed Mordred, but was himself mortally wounded. Geoffrey writes that Arthur was then carried away to the Isle of Avalon so that his wounds might be healed. He leaves the ending deliberately ambiguous. Arthur does not die, he disappears to a magical island to be healed. This was the beginning of the legend of the once and future king, the belief that Arthur did not truly die, but merely sleeps, waiting to return when Britain needs him most. Geoffrey of Monmouth's history was a sensation. It was copied and translated across Europe. It created the basic framework of the Arthurian legend that we still know today, but it was just the beginning. Over the following century, other writers would take Geoffrey's foundation and build something even grander upon it. They would add new characters, new themes, and new stories that would transform Arthur from a British hero into a universal symbol of ideal kingship. The next great leap in the Arthurian legend came from France. In the late 12th century, a poet named Chrétien de Troyes wrote a series of romances set in the world of King Arthur. Chrétien was not interested in Arthur's wars and conquests. He was interested in love and adventure. His poems focused not on Arthur himself, but on the knights of his court. He created some of the most famous figures in the entire legend. It was Chrétien who introduced the world to Sir Lancelot du Lac, the greatest knight in the world, who would tragically fall in love with Arthur's queen. It was Chrétien who first wrote of Camelot, giving Arthur's court a name that would become synonymous with a golden age. And it was Chrétien who began the story of the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail became the most mysterious and powerful element of the Arthurian legend. In Christian tradition, the Grail was said to be the cup that Jesus Christ used at the Last Supper. Some legends said it was also the vessel that caught his blood at the crucifixion, when a Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear. Joseph of Arimathea, the man who had provided the tomb for Christ's burial, was said to have brought the Grail to Britain. He established a line of Grail keepers who guarded the sacred vessel in a mysterious castle that could not be found by ordinary means. Chrétien began writing a story about a young knight named Percival, who sees a strange procession in a mysterious castle. He had arrived at the castle of the Fisher King, a ruler who had been wounded in some terrible way and could not be healed. A maiden carried a golden grail that glowed with a holy light. Another maiden carried a silver platter bearing a bleeding lance. These objects passed before Percival, while he sat at dinner with his wounded host. But Percival, because he was taught not to ask too many questions, failed to ask what the Grail was or whom it served. This failure had terrible consequences. If Percival had asked the right question, the Fisher King would have been healed. The land, which had become a wasteland because of the king's wound, would have been restored. Instead, Percival left the next morning without understanding what he had witnessed. Chrétien died before he could finish this story, leaving the mystery unsolved. What was the Grail? Whom did it serve? How could the wounded king be healed? These unanswered questions would haunt European literature for centuries. Other writers rushed to complete Chrétien's unfinished tale and to write their own Grail romances. Each gave a different answer. Some said the Grail was Christ's cup. Others said it was a stone from heaven. Others made it a platter or a cauldron or something entirely mysterious that could not be defined. The Grail became whatever the reader most desired, a symbol that could hold any meaning. The Grail became a powerful symbol of spiritual perfection, a goal that Arthur's knights could quest for, but that only the purest could achieve. It added a deep religious dimension to the Arthurian legend. Arthur's court was no longer just about military glory or courtly love. It was about the search for divine grace. The Knights of the Round Table were not just warriors, they were pilgrims on a spiritual journey. The Grail quest became the ultimate test, separating the truly virtuous from those who only appeared so. Most knights would fail. Only the holiest, the most innocent, would succeed. As the Grail legend evolved, a new hero emerged to achieve the impossible quest. His name was Galahad. He was the son of Lancelot, conceived through trickery when Lancelot was deceived into sleeping with a woman he believed was Guinevere. Despite his illegitimate birth, Galahad was raised in purity. He arrived at Camelot as a young man and immediately proved his worth by sitting in a seat at the Round Table called the Siege Perilous. This seat was reserved for the one who would achieve the Grail. Anyone else who sat in it would be destroyed. Galahad sat and was unharmed. A sword appeared, floating in a stone in the river, and only Galahad could draw it. The quest for the Grail began. Galahad succeeded where all others failed because he was without sin. He was a knight so pure that he was almost inhuman. When he finally found the Grail castle and asked the right questions, he was granted a vision of the divine mysteries. His quest complete, his soul perfect, Galahad was taken up into heaven. He did not return to Camelot. The Grail itself was removed from the earthly realm, carried away to heaven with the perfect knight. The quest was over. The highest achievement of Arthur's court had been accomplished, but at a cost. Many good knights had died in the search. The Round Table was weakened, and the world seemed a little emptier now that the Grail was gone. While the French poets added love and spirituality to the Arthurian legend, they also planted the seeds of its destruction. The love affair between Lancelot and Guinevere became central to the story. It was presented not as simple wickedness, but as a tragic passion that neither could control. Lancelot was the greatest knight in the world, Arthur's most trusted champion. No one could defeat him in battle. His devotion to Arthur was absolute. Guinevere was the most beautiful and noble queen. She was worthy of a great king and a great love. Their love was passionate and genuine, but it was also adulterous and treasonous. It violated every law of God and man. For years they concealed their affair. Lancelot would leave court for months at a time, trying to escape temptation. Guinevere would weep and rage at his absence. Then he would return, and their passion would overwhelm them again. Arthur may have suspected, but he loved them both too much to seek the truth. As long as no one spoke of it openly, as long as no proof was offered, he could pretend not to know. But there were others at court who didn't share the king's blindness. Knights like Agravain and Mordred watched and waited, gathering evidence, preparing to strike. Eventually the secret was revealed. Agravain and Mordred led a group of knights to catch Lancelot in the Queen's chamber. There was a confrontation. Lancelot, unarmed, killed or wounded all of the knights except Mordred, who escaped to tell the king. Now Arthur could no longer pretend. His queen had been caught in adultery. His best knight had killed other knights of the Round Table. The law was clear. The revelation tore the Round Table apart. Knights who had been brothers in arms now took sides. Some supported Lancelot. Others demanded justice. Arthur was forced to condemn his beloved wife to death as the law demanded. A queen caught in adultery must burn. Preparations were made. Guinevere was led to the stake. But everyone knew that Lancelot would come. He did come, with a company of his supporters, and he rescued the queen from the flames. In the desperate battle around the stake, Lancelot killed several of Arthur's finest knights, including Gareth and Gaheris, brothers of Gawain. They had been unarmed, attending the execution as a sad duty. Lancelot did not even realise he had killed them until afterward, but Gawain's grief turned to rage. He demanded that Arthur pursue Lancelot to the ends of the earth. Arthur pursued Lancelot to France, leaving Mordred in charge of Britain, and so the stage was set for the final tragedy. The English-speaking world received its definitive version of the Arthurian legend in the 15th century. A knight named Sir Thomas Malory, while imprisoned during the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, compiled and translated the various French and English Arthurian tales into one massive work. He called it The Whole Book of King Arthur and His Noble Knights of the Round Table. It was later published under the title Le Mort d'Arthur, which means the death of Arthur. Malory's book gathered all the scattered threads of the legend into a single coherent narrative. It told the complete story from Arthur's miraculous birth to his tragic death. Malory's Arthur is the model of medieval kingship. He is brave, generous and just. He creates the Round Table specifically so that no knight would sit higher than another. All would be equals, united by their oath to serve the king and uphold justice. The Round Table becomes a symbol of fellowship and equality, a circle without beginning or end. Arthur's court at Camelot becomes a beacon of civilization in a dark and dangerous world. Knights come from across Europe to join the fellowship. They swear to never commit murder or cruelty, to grant mercy to those who ask for it, to protect ladies and never force them, and to fight for justice against those who do evil. But Malory also shows how this golden age cannot last. The flaws of the human heart destroy what human hands have built. The adultery of Lancelot and Guinevere festers beneath the surface. The envy and hatred of knights like Mordred and Agravain grow in secret. When the truth is finally revealed, it is as if a dam has broken. All the suppressed tensions explode at once. Lancelot flees to France with Guinevere. Arthur, bound by law and honour, must pursue him. He lays siege to Lancelot's castle. The greatest warriors of the age, who once fought side by side, now kill each other. The Pope eventually forces a truce. Guinevere is returned. But while Arthur is in France, Mordred makes his move. Mordred's betrayal is the final and greatest wound. In most versions of the legend, Mordred is Arthur's son, born of an incestuous union between Arthur and his half-sister Morgause. Arthur did not know she was his sister when they slept together, but the sin still produced its terrible fruit. When Arthur learned of the child's birth, he tried to destroy him. In some versions, he ordered all children born on the same day to be set adrift at sea. But Mordred survived. He was raised in secret and eventually came to Arthur's court. He served as a knight and gained the king's trust, but all along he was waiting for his chance. When Arthur left for France to fight Lancelot, Mordred saw his opportunity. He spread false news that Arthur had been killed in battle. He crowned himself king. He tried to force Guinevere to marry him, claiming the throne through her, but Guinevere refused and fled to the Tower of London. When Arthur learned of the betrayal, he abandoned his war with Lancelot and rushed home. Mordred met him at the shore with an army of Saxons and traitors. The two forces clashed in a series of bloody battles that swept across southern Britain. The final battle was fought at a place called Camelot. The night before the battle, Arthur had a terrible dream. He dreamed that he sat upon a throne attached to a wheel, the wheel of fortune that raises men up and casts them down. Beneath the wheel was a dark pit filled with serpents and foul beasts. He sat upon the wheel in splendour, but then it turned and Arthur was cast down into the pit. He woke in terror, knowing that his doom was near. That same night, the ghost of Sir Gawain appeared to him. Gawain had been Arthur's nephew, and one of his most loyal knights. He had died from wounds received fighting Lancelot. Now his spirit came with a warning. He told Arthur not to fight Mordred tomorrow. If Arthur would delay the battle for just 1 month, Lancelot would arrive with an army to help him. Victory would be certain. But if Arthur fought tomorrow, he would die, and all his noble knights with him. Arthur took this warning to heart and decided to negotiate. A truce was arranged for the next day. Arthur and Mordred would meet between the two armies to discuss peace terms. but both sides distrusted the other deeply. Arthur told his knights that if anyone on Mordred's side drew a sword, they should attack immediately. Mordred gave the same instruction to his own men. Both armies stood ready, watching the small group of negotiators in the field between them. As Arthur and Mordred talked, trying to find some way to avoid the slaughter that both knew was coming, an adder slithered out of the grass. The snake bit one of the knights on the foot. Without thinking, the knight drew his sword to kill the serpent. The flash of steel was seen by both armies. Believing they had been betrayed, both sides charged. The horns sounded. The war cries rose. Thousands of men rushed toward each other. The peace was broken by a snake, the symbol of evil and treachery since the Garden of Eden. What followed was a slaughter beyond anything seen before. By the end of the day, nearly every knight on both sides was dead. The flower of British chivalry lay bleeding in the mud. A generation of heroes was destroyed in a single afternoon. Arthur found Mordred among the carnage. Father and son faced each other for the last time. Arthur ran Mordred through with his spear. But as he died, Mordred struck Arthur a terrible blow to the head with his sword. Arthur lay dying on the battlefield. Only one of his knights remained, a faithful companion named Bedivere. Arthur commanded Bedivere to take his sword Excalibur and throw it into a nearby lake. This was not the sword from the stone. That sword had broken in battle long ago. Excalibur was a different blade, a gift from the Lady of the Lake. When Arthur had broken his first sword, Merlin had brought him to a mysterious lake. A hand clothed in white silk rose from the waters, holding a magnificent sword in a jewelled scabbard. Arthur rode out and took the sword. The scabbard was even more precious than the blade. Whoever wore it could not lose blood from any wound. Now, at the end, Arthur wanted the sword returned to the lady who had given it. Bedivere went to the shore, but could not bear to throw away such a magnificent weapon. The blade gleamed in the moonlight. The hilt was studded with precious gems. Surely such a treasure should not be lost beneath the waters. He hid the sword under a tree and returned to Arthur, claiming he had done as ordered. Arthur asked what he had seen when the sword entered the water. Bedivere described nothing remarkable, just the wind and the waves. Arthur knew he had lied. He grew angry. He told Bedivere to go back and truly throw the sword into the lake. Bedivere returned to the shore. Again he took up Excalibur. Again he could not bring himself to throw it away. He thought of the battles that had been won with this blade. He thought of Arthur's glory and how the sword was the symbol of his reign. He hid it again and returned. Again Arthur asked what he had seen. Again Bedivere described nothing unusual. Arthur's anger turned to grief. He accused Bedivere of betraying him at the last for the sake of mere gold and gems. He begged him to go one final time and throw the sword away. If he failed again, Arthur said he would rise up and kill him with his own hands, wounded as he was. Finally, on the third attempt, Bedivere overcame his weakness. He took Excalibur by the belt and hurled it as far as he could out over the water. Before the sword could touch the surface, a hand rose from the lake. It caught the blade, brandished it 3 times in the air, and drew it down beneath the waves. The Lady of the Lake had reclaimed her gift. Bedivere reported this wonder to Arthur, who knew at last that his command had been obeyed. A barge appeared on the water, carrying several queens dressed in black. Among them was Morgan le Fay, Arthur's half-sister, and sometimes enemy. They lifted Arthur into the barge and began to carry him away. Bedivere cried out, asking where Arthur was going and what would become of Britain. Arthur replied that he was being taken to the Vale of Avalon, to be healed of his grievous wound. He said that if Britain ever needed him, he would return. The barge disappeared into the mist. Bedivere wandered in grief until he found a chapel with a fresh grave. The hermit told him that a company of ladies had brought a body for burial that very night. Bedivere believed it was Arthur's tomb, and he spent the rest of his days there in prayer. But the legend insists that Arthur did not truly die. He sleeps still in the magical Isle of Avalon, or perhaps in a cave beneath a hollow hill. He waits for the day when Britain faces its darkest hour. Then he will wake. He will take up Excalibur once more. He will ride out at the head of his knights and save his people. This is why he is called the once and future king. He was king once in the distant past. He will be king again in the future when the time is right. This belief was so strong in the Middle Ages that when King Edward I conquered Wales, he made a point of displaying what he claimed were Arthur's bones. He wanted to prove to the Welsh that Arthur was truly dead and would never return to free them. The legend of King Arthur has never stopped evolving. Every age has reimagined him to fit its own values and concerns. In the medieval period, he was the model of chivalric kingship, the perfect Christian warrior. In the Renaissance, poets like Edmund Spenser used Arthurian imagery to praise Queen Elizabeth. In the Victorian era, Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote the Idylls of the King, a massive poem cycle that used Arthur's story to explore themes of moral purity, duty, and the corruption of ideals. His Arthur was a sad and noble figure, a man whose perfect vision was destroyed by human weakness. Tennyson's work was enormously influential, shaping how the English-speaking world imagined Arthur for generations. In the 20th century, Arthur continued to transform. The writer T.H. White reimagined the legend in The Once and Future King, a novel that began as a light-hearted fantasy and grew into a profound meditation on war, power, and human nature. White's Arthur is a dreamer who tries to channel the violence of his knights into justice. He creates the idea of might for right, using military power to enforce peace rather than conquest. But he ultimately fails because human nature cannot be changed by laws alone. White's book influenced everything from the Disney film The Sword in the Stone, to the Broadway musical Camelot, to the entire genre of modern Arthurian fiction. The legend has also spread far beyond Britain. Arthur has been claimed by the French, who contributed so much to his story. He has been adopted by Americans who see in Camelot a symbol of idealism and lost promise. The Kennedy presidency was famously called Camelot by his widow after his assassination, associating the slain president with the noble king struck down before his work was complete. Arthur has appeared in countless films, television shows, novels, and video games. Each new version adds something to the legend while drawing on what came before. The story is infinitely adaptable because at its core, it speaks to universal themes of heroism, betrayal, love, duty, and loss. What is it about Arthur that has made his legend so enduring? Perhaps it is the sense of a golden age that was lost. Every generation feels that the world was better in some imagined past. Arthur represents that perfect moment, that brief shining time, when justice ruled and heroes were true. Camelot is the kingdom that almost was, the dream that almost came true. Its fall is tragic precisely because it came so close to lasting. If only Lancelot had been stronger, if only Guinevere had been faithful, if only Mordred had not been born. The story is filled with these ifs, these moments where a different choice might have changed everything. Perhaps it is also the promise of return. Arthur does not simply die and leave the world forever. He waits, he sleeps. He will come back when needed. This is a powerful idea, especially for people who feel lost or defeated. It says that hope is never truly gone. The hero is merely resting. The golden age can come again. In the darkest times when everything seems hopeless, Arthur will return. This belief has sustained people through wars and plagues and political disasters. It transforms despair into patient hope. The places of the Arthurian legend still draw visitors today. In Cornwall, Tintagel Castle perches on dramatic cliffs above the sea. This is where Geoffrey of Monmouth placed Arthur's conception. The ruins there today are from a later medieval castle, but archaeologists have found evidence of a wealthy and powerful settlement from the Dark Ages. Perhaps a real British king did rule here when Rome was just a memory. In Somerset, Glastonbury Tor rises mysteriously from the flat marshlands. Medieval monks at Glastonbury Abbey claimed they had found Arthur's grave. They said they had discovered a great oak coffin with a lead cross that identified the body as Arthur, the famous king. Historians are sceptical, suspecting the monks invented the discovery to attract pilgrims and money. But the legend persists. Glastonbury is still associated with Avalon, the mystical isle where Arthur was taken to be healed. In Wales, the landscape is dotted with Arthurian sites. Bardsey Island, off the tip of the Llyn Peninsula, has been identified with Avalon. Snowdonia's mountains are said to contain caves where Arthur and his knights sleep. The fortress of Dinas Emrys is associated with Merlin and his prophecies. These places keep the legend alive in the land itself. When you walk these hills and shores, you walk in Arthur's country. The mist rising from a Welsh valley could be the enchantment of Morgan Le Fay. The ruin on the hilltop could be the last fragment of Camelot. The legend has soaked into the soil. The Knights of the Round Table have their own immortality. Lancelot remains the tragic hero, the greatest knight who fell through love. His story has been told and retold, exploring the conflict between passion and duty. Gawain, Arthur's nephew, represents loyalty and courtesy, a rough northern warrior who became a model of chivalric behaviour. His story, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, is one of the masterpieces of medieval English literature. Percival represents the innocent fool who stumbles into greatness, the unlikely hero who achieves the Grail because he is too pure to be corrupted. Galahad represents perfection, a standard so high that ordinary humans cannot reach it. Each knight offers a different model of heroism, a different path through the challenges of life. Merlin the wizard has become as famous as Arthur himself. In the earlier stories, he is a wild man of the woods, a prophet driven mad by the horrors of war. Geoffrey of Monmouth transformed him into the power behind Arthur's throne, the master of magic, who arranged the king's birth and guided his early reign. Later writers made him Arthur's tutor, the wise old man who teaches the young king about justice and mercy. In modern stories, Merlin has become everything from a dotty old professor to a young man learning his craft alongside Arthur. His magic represents the wonder and mystery that the modern world has lost. When Merlin appears, anything is possible. The women of the legend have been reimagined most dramatically in recent years. Guinevere was long portrayed as either a passive victim or a faithless adulteress. Modern writers have given her agency and depth, exploring the impossible position of a queen caught between duty and desire. Morgan Le Fay has undergone an even greater transformation. In the earlier stories, she is Arthur's healer, a benevolent fairy who carries him to Avalon. Later medieval writers turned her into a villain, an evil enchantress who plots Arthur's destruction. Recent interpretations have reimagined her as a complex figure, sometimes sympathetic, representing the old pagan ways being displaced by Christianity. The Lady of the Lake, who gives Arthur his sword Excalibur, has similarly grown from a minor magical figure into a powerful and mysterious presence. The Round Table itself has become a symbol that transcends the legend. When people speak of a round table discussion, they mean a meeting where all participants are equal, where no one sits at the head. This democratic ideal was present in the legend from the beginning. Arthur created the Round Table specifically to prevent quarrels over precedence. By making the table circular, he eliminated the possibility that any knight could claim a higher seat than another. This simple idea has resonated across centuries. It suggests that true fellowship requires equality, that hierarchy leads to conflict, and that the best decisions come when all voices are heard. The legend of King Arthur has survived because it speaks to something deep in human nature. We want to believe in heroes who are brave and true. We want to imagine a time when justice prevailed and evil was punished. We want to hope that even when the world seems dark, a saviour waits to return. Arthur's story satisfies all these desires. It gives us a golden age to dream about, a cast of noble characters to admire, and a promise that the dream might come again. It is a legend that refuses to die because we refuse to let it die. Every generation retells the story, adding new details while preserving the essential core. And what is that core? Perhaps it is simply this. Once there was a king who tried to make the world better. He gathered the best people he could find. He gave them a noble purpose. For a brief time, they succeeded. Then human weakness, human passion, and human treachery tore it all apart. The king fell. The kingdom collapsed. The dream died, but the memory survived. Oh, and as long as people remember the dream is never truly lost. Arthur sleeps in Avalon. The sword waits beneath the lake. And somewhere, in some future hour of desperate need, the once and future king will wake again. The mist rolls across the British hills tonight, as it has for 1,500 years. The ancient stone stands silent in the darkness. The old forests whisper with memories of another age. Beneath those hills, in hidden caves and hollow mountains, the legend says that Arthur lies with his knights around him, their armour bright, their swords ready. They sleep the long sleep of enchantment, waiting for the call that will summon them back to the world. The call has not come yet. Perhaps it never will. Perhaps Arthur truly died at Camelot, and his body lies in the simple grave that Bedivere found. But perhaps, just perhaps, the legends are true. Perhaps the once and future king still waits. And on nights like this, when the mist is thick and the ancient places seem close, it is easy to believe that Arthur is merely sleeping. dreaming of Camelot and waiting for the day when Britain will need him once more.